By way of introduction to chapter 46 of Genesis, we review Joseph, the 11th of Jacob's 12 sons, sold into slavery by jealous brothers, has risen via a rather torturous route to become second only to Pharaoh in 20th century BC Egypt. 3 decades later, those once jealous brothers appear before Joseph to beg for food for their famine-starved families back in Canaan. They don't recognize Joseph, and he's uncertain of what time has done with them. So after a trial of their character spread over many months, Joseph sees that they deeply regret the way that they treated him, and that given the opportunity to do again what they had done before, they refuse. And so Jacob reveals himself to his brothers, urges them to return to Canaan, gather their families and his aged father, and return to Egypt, since there are going to be several more years of the famine. Chapter 45 ends with the brothers having to return home to, well, fess up to their old man that they'd sold his favorite son into slavery years before. But God had not only preserved Joseph's life, he'd promoted him to great prominence in Egypt. Jacob, bearing his new name Israel, was at first suspicious of the report, but when he saw all of the goodies that Joseph had sent along with them, he relented and allowed himself to believe that Joe was still alive, and then he would get a chance to see him. Verse 1, so Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. Israel's clan made their way south from their base at Hebron. As they did, they stopped at Beersheba, the place where both his father and grandfather had spent some time. Beersheba lies at the northern border of the Negev desert. In chapter 21, Israel's grandfather Abraham had planted a grove of shade trees in anticipation of God's promise to give his descendants the entire land. So as they're now passing through, those trees have grown tall to provide a place to rest. They stood as a testimony to Abraham's storied faith, but God's even greater faithfulness. I wonder if Israel wondered if going to Egypt was the right thing. After all, going to Egypt had always been a sign of a lack of faith for his ancestors. It was during a similar famine back in chapter 12 that Abraham went to Egypt and got into real trouble. God had told Isaac not to go to Egypt in chapter 26. Yet from what Joseph had said to Israel's other sons, it was clear that God had sent him to Egypt to prepare for this famine. So maybe going to Egypt was God's will. How was Israel to know?
Should I stay or should I go?
Verse 2, then God spoke to Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. And so he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. Meaning that Joseph will be there to close Jacob's now lifeless eyes when he eventually dies. Verse 5. Then Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob, their little ones, and their wives in the carts which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. Well, Israel, Jacob, is old enough now that he needs assistance to keep up with the pace of the family. They wanted to make the best time possible, again because of the famine, and so they loaded up all that they had and headed south on the well-traveled road to Egypt. Verse 6. And so they took their livestock and their goods, which they had acquired in the land of Canaan, and went to Egypt, Jacob and all his descendants with him. His sons and his sons' sons, his daughters and his sons' daughters, and all his descendants he brought with him to Egypt. They had no idea how long they would be in Egypt, and so they had to take everything with them. Verse 8. Now these were the names of the children of Israel, Jacob and his sons, who went to Egypt. Reuben was Jacob's firstborn. And then we have a list of Jacob's sons and their families. It gives the names of those who become the 12 tribes of Israel along with their major clans. I'm not going to read these verses, but verses 9 through 15 are the descendants of Jacob and his wife Leah. 33 people are named. Verses 16 through 18 are the 16 descendants of Zilpah. Verses 19 through 22, the 14 descendants of Rachel. And then verses 23 through 25, the 7 descendants of Bilhah. It's a total of 70 people. Verse 26. All the persons who went with Jacob to Egypt, who came from his body, besides Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2 persons. All the persons of the house of Jacob who went to Egypt were 70. So you have the 66 descendants of Jacob who make this trip, plus Jacob himself at 67, Add Joseph and his 2 sons, that's 70. So over the next 400 years, that's going to turn into a nation of between 2 and 3 million. Verse 28. Then he sent to Judah before him Joseph to point out before him the way to Goshen, and they came to the land of Goshen. So Israel, Jacob again, sent Judah on ahead to contact Joseph and find out exactly where they were to locate. It was somewhere in the region of Goshen, the Nile Delta, what's referred to historically as Lower Egypt. Now, modern students of the Bible get confused by historic references to Egypt as upper and lower because they think in terms of compass points, north, south, east, and west. The ancients tended to think more in terms of topography. So up meant higher in elevation, lower meant lower. The Nile is somewhat unusual in that it flows from the highlands in the south to the lowlands in the north. So that makes Upper Egypt south of Lower Egypt. Confused? Welcome to the exciting world of geography and history. Verse 29. So Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. And he presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. Man, imagine what a happy reunion that must have been. So why the weeping? Well, these were tears of just sheer and unexpected joy. Verse 30. And Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen your face, because you are still alive. Now, seems kind of an odd thing to say. What Israel means is that he can now die in peace. Verse 31. Then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh and say to him, my brothers and those of my father's house who were in the land of Canaan have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for their occupation has been to feed livestock, and they have brought their flocks, their herds, and all that they have. And so it shall be, when Pharaoh calls you and says, what's your occupation? That you shall say, your servant's occupation has been with livestock from our youth even until now, both we and also our fathers, that you may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. So if Egyptians consider shepherding an abomination, and people who make their living by tending sheep off limits, we might think that Joseph would want to keep that a secret. But Joseph is again showing a large dose of the wisdom that he possesses. You see, he wants to keep his family from being absorbed into the Egyptian culture like so many other groups had been. Egyptian culture was so appealing, prosperous, and influential that it was overpowering. Many smaller groups had been just gobbled up by Egypt, kind of like American culture has consumed dozens of others over the years. That was the danger that Jacob's family faced, that they might be, assimilated into the monolithic Egyptian culture. But there was something in the Egyptian mindset that Joseph knew he could use to help his family maintain their God-ordained uniqueness, the aversion of Egyptians to shepherds. Now, Egyptian art from that time marks shepherds as the very lowest level of Egyptian society. Goshen on their northeastern border was scarcely populated, but it was prime grazing land. And so Joseph knew that it would be perfect for his family's needs and would keep them isolated from Egyptian influences. Well, now we come to chapter 47, verse 1. Then Joseph went and told Pharaoh and said, my father and my brothers, their flocks and their herds, and all that they possess have come from the land of Canaan, and they indeed are in the land of Goshen. And he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to his brothers, what's your occupation? And they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers. And they said to Pharaoh, we have come to dwell in the land because your servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now, therefore, please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. Now, there's a subtle but important insight here. That word dwell, used twice in verse 4, refers to a temporary, not permanent stay. Joseph was careful to coach his brothers to say this because they weren't supposed to stay in Egypt. They were only there for the duration of the famine. They made it clear to Pharaoh that they were only sojourning in Egypt and ought to be allowed to go home when they chose. As Joseph was careful to coach his brothers to state it that way, Moses was careful to record it years later. The Jews' detention and enslavement by the Egyptians years later was illegal because the original arrangement was that they ought to be free to leave when they chose. Verse 5. Then Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and your brothers dwell," and again it's the same word, "in the best of the land. Let them dwell in the land of Goshen. And if you know any competent men among them, then make them chief herdsmen over my livestock." Then Joseph brought in his father Jacob and set him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How old are you?" Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers and the days of their pilgrimage." And so Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from before Pharaoh. It was obvious that Jacob was ancient, and so Pharaoh asked, "Hey, how old are you?" And Pharaoh's deference to Jacob reveals how much respect he had for Joseph, Jacob's son. Verse 11, "And Joseph situated his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Then Joseph provided for his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with bread, according to the number in their families." Now, critics, they love to point to verse 11 as a problem, because this region wasn't called Ramesses until long after Jacob and Joseph's time. And they're right. It was called that during Moses' time, the one who wrote this. The region of Goshen in the Nile Delta is where Jacob's family settled. When a later dynasty rose to rule in Egypt, they followed a different policy towards foreigners living among them, subjecting them to slavery. They made new cities along the Nile using slave labor, and one of those cities was Ramesses, named after one of their greater pharaohs. Jews were a major part of the workforce that built the city of Ramses. And because the city was a major landmark, the whole region became known as, well, Ramses, just as the county where I live, Ventura County, is named after its oldest and most well-known city, Ventura. Now, that's an obvious answer to the objection of critics over the use of the word Ramses in verse 11, and all it takes is a little thought to work it out. So why do critics still mention it? Because those who don't want to believe the Bible cling to any and everything to justify their unbelief. And this points up a frustrating reality for those doing apologetics. Critics, skeptics, scoffers, mockers, whatever label you want to give to determined unbelievers, the objections they raise have all already been amply answered. No one is coming up with anything new. They just recycle the same old, tired, and worn-out arguments that have already been refuted, rebuffed, and dismantled. The more you examine the objections and their answers, the clearer it becomes. The problem isn't that people can't believe, it's that they won't. In numerous conversations that I've had with chronic skeptics over the years, what happens is they give a reason for their unbelief. I'll answer it, showing how the very thing that they have used to support not believing turns out to be a reason they ought to. In other words, their objection doesn't hold. It isn't reasonable in light of the evidence, and they have no comeback, no further reason to cling to that objection any longer. Now, you would think that they would then move from unbelief to belief. Logically, if they've been shown that their unbelief has no evidential support, but that in fact the evidence points to belief in God, in the gospel, then that would be where they go, where they lead. But the inveterate skeptic doesn't. They just shift to their next objection, and then the next, and then another. So what I like to do is this. After dismantling one of their objections, when they say, well, what about? I don't let them off. I don't let them shift to another objection. My goal is to help them realize that their unbelief isn't reasonable. They need to come to grips with the evidence of their own prejudice against faith. The bottom line is they don't believe because they don't want to. Well, now we get an account of Joseph's administration of Egypt during the famine. Verse 13. Now there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. The only food to be had was, well, what had been stored during the 7 years of bumper crops prior to the onset of the 7 years of famine. And so the people went to the storehouses for supplies, bought what they needed, and after a while their savings were gone. They still needed food. Pharaoh's coffers were full, but their bellies were empty. Verse 15. So when the money failed in the land of Egypt, and note this, in the land of Canaan, All the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us bread, for why should we die in your presence? For the money has failed." Then Joseph said, "Give your livestock, and I will give you bread for your livestock if the money is gone." And so they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the cattle of the herds, and for the donkeys. Thus he fed them with bread in exchange for all their livestock that year. So after money, the most liquid asset was livestock, which they traded for food. Now, that doesn't mean that their herds were literally transferred over to Pharaoh. I mean, there was no way that his servants could tend such, huge herds and flocks. It was the title to them that merely transferred to Pharaoh. The people themselves ended up becoming his servants, taking care of his herds. Verse 18. When that year had ended, they came to him the next year and said, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is gone. My lord also has our herds and our livestock. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be servants of Pharaoh. Give us seed that we may live and not die, that the land may not be desolate." Then Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every man of the Egyptians sold his field, because the famine was severe upon them. So the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he moved them into the cities from one end of the borders of Egypt to the other end. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had rations allotted to them by Pharaoh, and they ate their rations which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their lands. So once the title to the livestock was transferred to Pharaoh, all that was left was the land, which they also turned over to him. It was during Joseph's rule that Egypt became a kind of, feudal society and economy. Pharaoh's power became absolute, with the people serving as serfs, working the land. The only group that Pharaoh did not gain control over were the priests. He probably feared their connection to the gods, and since his condition in the afterlife would be determined by those deities, he wanted to stay in good standing with the priests, and so they weren't subject to the same requirements as the rest of the people. Pharaoh had set aside provisions for the priests. They were on a, government-funded dole, if you will. Religion reigned supreme in Egypt, with a usually steady alliance between the temple and the throne. The priests said that Pharaoh was a living embodiment of one of the Egyptian gods. And in return, Pharaoh allowed the priests control over a huge segment of Egyptian society. Verse 23. Then Joseph said to the people, "Indeed, I have bought you and your land this day for Pharaoh. Look, here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And it shall come to pass in the harvest that you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field and for your food, and for those of your households, and as food for your little ones." So Joseph comes up with a brilliant plan. All the land now belongs to Pharaoh, but he needs the people to work it. So he tells them that when the famine is over and they return to farming, they can stay on their land, but they will need to give Pharaoh 20% of their income. In verse 21, it says that Joseph moved the people into cities. Now, it may have been a temporary arrangement during the famine so that they could be more easily provided for from the regional storehouses. But then they probably returned to their ancestral homes when the famine was over. Or the relocation may have led to a more permanent arrangement in which, after the famine, the Egyptians reallocated the land according to a different system. There is some evidence of a major redistribution of land during Egypt's history. That then led to a radical restructuring of Egyptian society that further added to Pharaoh's power. Verse 25. So they said, "You have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants." And Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt to this day that Pharaoh should have 1/5, except for the land of the priests only, which did not become Pharaoh's. So Israel, and Moses now uses that name not just for Jacob, but for the people that will come to be known as Israel, the 12 tribes. So Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions there and grew and multiplied exceedingly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. When the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "Now, if I have found favor in your sight, please put your hand under my thigh and deal kindly and truly with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. You shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. And he said, I will do as you have said. Then he said, swear to me. And he swore to him. So Israel bowed himself on the head of the bed, meaning that he's now bedridden. Jacob makes Joseph promise to bury him back in Hebron with his father and grandfather. Now, we took a look at that phrase, to put one's hand under the thigh, in an earlier study. It signals a super solemn promise.